Hello, everyone. My name is Dalia Iskander, and I actually work more in malaria, but I teach on this biosocial masters as well, and looking at what we can kind of learn from other infectious diseases to shed light also on COVID-19. So when it comes to COVID-19, in the spirit of multi-species perspectives, which tend to put non-humans into view in terms of thinking about descriptions of life, anthropologists such as Eben Kirksey have described COVID-19 as a multi-species entanglement. So coronaviruses have been around for thousands of years. They're constantly evolving and mutating, jumping from species to species as part of their life cycle. And they actually need host cells to reproduce. The virus uses the machinery of the host cell to replicate single-strand RNA by locking spike proteins onto what are called ACE2 receptors on host cells. And as they do this, they actually replicate imperfectly. Errors are produced or mutations that then become passed on to the next generation, and some are protective and some are not. So when we consider it from a virus's point of view, the actual type of host species or cell isn't what matters. What's important is how good this fit is. And it seems that actually humans or other domesticated animals such as cats and farm animals actually appear to have the best fit, which is interesting when we start to think of these narratives that have emerged around COVID-19, linking it to kind of wild animals and wet markets. And I'll come to that a bit later on. But as RNA viruses such as COVID-19 mutate, they create such diversity that it actually becomes difficult to determine their origin and to predict what future versions will look like or what cells they'll be able to lock onto next and what kinds of species. Again, we can think about these origin narratives that have permeated the media, as well as kind of think ways to control something which actually thrives on diversity. Diversity is their strength. It offers viruses protection from a group perspective. And this is why RNA viruses like COVID-19 are often described by microbiologists as being mutant swarms or clouds. So for an RNA virus like COVID-19, replicating itself or replicating itself perfectly isn't the goal. It's actually imperfections and mutations which help it to survive, change, move, and adapt. So what does all of this mean when we try to understand COVID-19? Well, essentially, it's probably been circulating in human populations long before it was discovered in links to kind of wet markets, and that it's actually already evolved. It's already mutated. It's gone from being a very highly virulent and less mobile virus that was killing older or vulnerable people quite quickly to being something which is less virulent, more mobile. We see asymptomatic cases increasing, chronic illness in younger and healthier people. So the virus really exists in context, and it actually responds to human behavior. So all of this is really important when we try to understand a virus or a disease like COVID-19 from a biosocial perspective. Because as Kirksey describes, there is no linear path of emergence. Instead, a tangled web of relations with jumping genes that defy human attempts to cordon off species from each other. Viruses are transformed as they interact with immune systems of animal hosts and ecological communities, and with human institutions, infrastructures, and behavior that facilitate their spread. So really, from a biosocial perspective, we emphasize the entanglement between humans and non-human world, as well as between the biological and social. And yet, as Kelly and Lausanne have argued, and really this was in relation to malaria, which is the disease that I work on, but I think it applies to other diseases, that control initiatives are often a task of laborious disentanglement, the disentanglement of humans from non-humans. And so how do we fit this with this idea of entanglement? How does this relate to COVID-19? Well, we can see that rhetorically, for example, COVID-19 has been described as something that we can beat. Military metaphors are described in terms of how we can potentially win the war. And this disentangles humans from the realm of nature. Nature is now seen as something by implication that can be controlled, fought against, even destroyed. But simultaneously, with every disentanglement, we have an entanglement. Viruses become entangled in the realm of the wild and the exotic, potentially obscuring the very human and cultural relations of power, which have actually shaped ecologies, actions that range from deforestation to policies on global food distribution and production. And so too in terms of interventions such as hand washing or social distancing, which are really designed to disentangle people from viruses by killing them or disrupting their chains of transmission. But this kind of disentanglement brings with it another form of entanglement, entangling disease control and responsibility really with the individual, obscuring perhaps the very collective relations of power that shape disease emergence and spread and transmission in unequal ways, and the collective responsibility that governments have in actually tackling the societal and structural causes of disease. And finally, when we start to think of the treatments and cures for COVID-19, such as drugs or this potential vaccine which has been announced, again, these are designed to disentangle, or they are rather disentangled from very local contexts, as they're set up as being these kind of neutral biotechnological tools which have the same effect everywhere. And so it simultaneously becomes entangled, these kinds of tools, in the world of the humanitarian. These are set up as humanitarian goods, which we have a moral obligation to deploy and accept as populations, perhaps obscuring the fact that these are actually economic goods produced by global corporations and then fit into local contexts where they can have very different effects, but also very different receptions. We can think about kind of protests against vaccines, for example, which I think my colleagues are going to talk about later. So really, a biosocial perspective helps us to think about these forms of entanglement and disentanglement when applied to something like COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Dahlia. The next presenter is Alex Tasker, who's a lecturer in human ecology in the department.
Hello all. Let me just pop mine up as well, if that's all right. If someone could just make some noise to tell me that you can see.
Yes.
Fantastic. Yes. Well, it's lovely to virtually see everyone this morning, and it's a wonderful topic. I think a really interesting chance to unpick what's going on there. So my name's Alex. I'm a lecturer in human ecology, but I'm only 50%. I'm also 50%. I work for the government at the moment. I've been seconded on a COVID task force, so looking at international responses to COVID. So I'm happy to talk about both, particularly in the questions later on, to some degree as much as I can. Now, what I'm going to talk about today actually builds directly on what Dahlia was talking about, this really fascinating idea of entanglement. But hopefully we can take that and these connections happen where all these relationships are built. But we have to ask ourselves the question, how do we begin to unpack that? How do we begin to unpack our understanding and also our interventions if we're going to do those interventions? So to really frame COVID in a slightly larger way, zoonotic diseases, and that's those that can move between animals and humans and vice versa, are actually now the majority of new infections around the globe, and they pose really fundamental health risks. I can't overstate where this might go in the future. This is a topic that everyone should be really thinking about. The emergence or re-emergence, depending on how you define it, of diseases is actually really difficult to begin to unpack, and it hinges on interactions between human, animal, environmental relationships, and those relationships really are key. Dahlia talked about wet markets and the movement of people into different spaces. If we think about unprecedented levels of global forced migration, people are occupying new spaces, new niches all the time. Globalization allows movement of virus and pathogens around the world as we've never seen it before. And actually, when we're thinking about these relationships, the relationships exist on multiple kind of domains and ecologies, in social, physical, political ecologies. So we really need to be thinking about how these all play into one another. So it's vital to understand as well, when we're thinking about this big mess of what's going on and driving and co-creation, that actually the diseases themselves and their impacts and their origins are experienced differently between and within communities. And we can see that on our doorsteps. Conversations that are being had now around COVID in the UK. We're talking about age, which I think Carrie will be talking about, public spaces with Aaron. Denise is going to be talking about vaccines. And the idea of uptake or denial or impact or effect does differ massively. And we need to understand how that affects individuals and communities. And the response to these kind of threats actually requires the building of new relationships across disciplines or domains. The idea that medics do medicine and sociologists do sociology and everyone else has their own silos is not the way that we're going to work towards engaging with these kind of complexities that we need to talk about. I'm going to very quickly introduce the idea of One Health. It's something you may have heard of, and particularly I'm going to use the One Health cosmos, which is an image you'll see in a second, to kind of illustrate where these relationships can be thought of. But then we'll have a quick think about how these kind of approaches can actually be thought about in regards of COVID-19. So I'm going to move on to the slide now. Don't get scared. I get it's complicated, but this is one way of thinking about One Health and these relationships. And what I'd really like you to concentrate on here are the three red blocks. Okay, so there's human, ecosystem, and animal domains there. And what the authors here have tried to do is show how all of the interactions or begin to map where these influences happen. So in the middle, you can see food security, for example. Over effectively to the west or the left-hand side, there's economies and globalization, travel, and then you've got wildlife and livestock on the right-hand side, the east side there. But actually what we'd like to do now is have a little bit of a closer look at this bottom part, okay? And so if we look a bit closer here, we've got human medicine, vaccinations, education, public health, media, global health. These are all things which we are presented with day to day when dealing with COVID. You've seen them, you've experienced them on your smartphone, in the press, and actually thinking about how these interrelationships work gives a really key understanding of where biosocial approaches can help. Understanding the links between the zoonoses at the top there, that white box, and all of these impacts and drivers of each helps us begin to unpack what we can do, how we can do it, and what the effects are likely to be. I mean, in the UK at the moment, and these figures are from this morning, we still need to think about what we can do. I mean, if you can see the level of patients admitted are up for about nearly 5% in the last week, but deaths within 28 days of positive test up 33% in the last week. That's a third. This is something which is we are struggling to engage with, and without the biosocial behind these stats, behind these kind of models, we need to think about very carefully about what we're doing. So what questions can we ask, and what should we be thinking about? Well, firstly, I think as Dalia raised, and Denise will definitely pick up, there is a vaccine coming. Well, in fact, there are multiple vaccines coming.
And I think there are some.
Hello, I can hear someone's microphone on if that's an issue. But there are multiple vaccines coming. And we need to think about not only do they work, in what ways do they work, but who gets them? How do we distribute them? Who are preference and who are disadvantaged by them? We've then also got to think about the effects we're having now and in the future. Now, this article was a couple of days ago, I think in The Independent, which is looking at the links between immunisation strength and exercise in children. What are the implications we're having long term? Biosocial is perfectly positioned to try and bring together disciplines to understand these future demands and threats. And actually, we can't forget that this is not a UK. We should never forget this is a UK. This is only a UK issue. This is from June. I mean, Tanzania was declared COVID-free by the John Magufuli, who suggested through prayer they managed to remove COVID from Tanzania. Now, I mean, the comment at the bottom there is he praised worshippers for not wearing masks and gloves, or NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions. If we consider ourselves to be interconnected with the rest of the world, be it the natural world, be it any of these other domains or ecologies we're talking about, how do we approach these problems from a global perspective as much as a local? And that's where I really feel that I think biosocial comes into its own. This is where we can really think very carefully about what it means to be interconnected and what we can do with these things. So I'm just going to swap back there, but thank you very much for your time. And any other questions, I look forward to seeing them at the end.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was great. Some really important and fascinating questions raised there. My talk is next. My short talk this morning, I want to talk about the embodied inequalities of COVID-19 and how a biosocial approach is relevant. So I think the issue of inequalities has perhaps been one of the most visible dynamics of the pandemic, and these intersect on a global and local scale, as numerous headlines and reports have made very evident. But I think it's also evident that these inequalities encompass not just the direct impact of the virus, but the consequences of measures to control it. And these impact certain communities more than others: women, the poor, elderly, and the disabled, to name but a few. So I think biosocial approaches very much help us to think through the intersections of these inequalities and their embodied consequences. Biosocial approaches help us to examine the intersections and through, as I said, the embodied consequences. And there are, I think, key concepts here that help us do that. Nancy Krieger's ecosocial theory, the notion of syndemics, put forward by Singer and Mendenhall, are particularly important in examining the intersection between different diseases and how social inequalities shape the impact, course, and consequence of this disease. So we see the intersecting inequalities very clearly, I think, of COVID-19 in the UK and their syndemic effect. Gender, housing, employment, region, age, ethnicity, and poverty, disability are all aspects of this landscape of inequalities, embodied inequalities that I think have become very visible over the last 8 months. And one community particularly has been notably affected in the UK by the COVID-19, and that's been the Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. And really the latest data is very stark in this sense. We have data that suggests that 36% of all critically COVID-19 patients in the UK are from an ethnic minority group, while representing only 13% of the general population. And Black and Asian minority ethnic community groups are twice as likely to die than white groups. The explanations for this are unfolding. Genetic factors have no basis. That has become evident. But rather, occupation, region, housing, deprivation, pre-existing conditions are all part of the story. And the question of racism is also part of the story, although explored and examined in some contexts more than others and subject to ongoing discussion and debate as well. But I think the complexity of this situation makes it vitally important to adopt a biosocial approach that can critically and reflexively examine how inequalities, discrimination and oppression become embodied across time to develop what has been called a whole person view of biology. And this is exactly what anthropologist Lance Gravelly suggests is required when he states that an ethical scientific response to COVID-19 demands that we honour the highest standards of evidence in evaluating genetic guesswork while measuring the biological costs of systemic racism and intervening to stop it. So I think it's a message that further underlines the value and importance of a biosocial approach for further examining and intervening on health inequalities in the context of COVID-19. Thanks very much. I'm going to pass on now to the next person, unshare my screen. And the next speaker is Denise Gulsalali, who's a lecturer in biological anthropology.
So hello everyone, I'm Deniz Salalı. I'm a lecturer in evolutionary anthropology, and I'm also teaching a module on evolutionary medicine as part of the Biosocial Medical Anthropology program. So I'm interested in understanding why we find certain beliefs and information more attractive than others, and whether our evolved cognitive mechanism, cognitive biases, have anything to do with why we find certain beliefs easier to understand and why certain beliefs spread faster in populations. So one such belief is the belief that vaccines are harmful, and it has been, this information has been on the rise, that belief has been on the rise across the world. And vaccine hesitancy is a term that is coined to explain a delay in acceptance or refusal of vaccines. And as I said, this has been on the rise so much that WHO in 2019 said that it's one of the top 10 threats to global health recently. And due to the vaccine hesitancy as well, we have been seeing increases in measles cases worldwide in some countries, especially, for example, in the European region. WHO recorded an almost threefold increase in the measles cases. So I have been interested in understanding why people are hesitant about vaccinations in general. And then since the start of you see my slides going forward, right, by the way? Yeah, okay, great. So since the start of the pandemic, I have also come across with many people who were having different theories on the origin of the novel coronavirus. So then I was interested in understanding whether there is any association between people's virus origin beliefs and their willingness to vaccinate for a potential COVID-19 vaccine. So for this reason, a colleague of mine in Turkey and I decided to make a survey in May 2020 during the lockdown. And we did this survey. We were interested in cross-cultural responses, and we were able to do it both in Turkey and in the UK. And we had almost 5,000 participants in both countries. And then we asked people about their willingness to vaccinate for a potential COVID-19 vaccine and what their beliefs were on the origin of the novel coronavirus, whether they thought it was of natural origin, so it was originated in wildlife, or whether they thought it had an artificial origin. So, for example, it was originated in a laboratory by humans, or if they're not sure about it. And then we also gathered several demographic information, like people's gender and their education levels, and also some behavioral factors like their anxiety levels. So the most important predictor that explained that was associated with COVID-19 vaccine acceptance rates were virus origin beliefs. So here in the plot, you're seeing the percentage of people who are willing to accept a potential COVID-19 vaccine. And in Turkey, among people who believed that the origin of the novel coronavirus was artificial, only 48% said that they were willing to accept a potential COVID-19 vaccine. Whereas if people in Turkey, if they believed in the natural origin, then their willingness to vaccinate for a potential vaccination rose to 77%. And we had similar results for the UK as well. Well, it's not that surprising because recent research also has shown that vaccine hesitancy in general, not only for the COVID-19 vaccine, is associated with conspiratorial worldview. And these artificial origin ideas are often hand in hand with the conspiracy theories, right? So vaccine hesitancy is in general associated with this worldview, which is associated with, in general, rejection of scientific explanations. So vaccine hesitancy may only be part of this, that people who are in general not believing in scientific explanations are also more likely to believe in conspiracy theories and more likely to be hesitant for vaccines. So I'm interested in why people find certain scientific information not acceptable. And there may be several cognitive biases to explain this. For example, we have an intuitive bias, which means that we find information that is in line with our intuitions more acceptable, more understandable. But most scientific explanations are often not intuitive. Like, think about an explanation that the world is round. This has taken quite a long time for humans to accept. And similarly, the information that injecting a dose of weakened microorganism into your body is going to be beneficial for your health is not quite intuitive, right? So that may be one reason. Another is the omission bias. Especially under uncertainty, people tend to do nothing rather than taking an action. And because there's a lot of still uncertainties about the novel coronavirus, we don't know much about it. So people may decide to do nothing rather than, getting a vaccination. And on top of this, we have this bias for cherry picking information. So we usually tend to believe in information that reinforces our pre-existing beliefs, which renders many pro-vaccination campaigns ineffective because people are not willing to see the evidence of, the benefits of vaccines, for example. So I'm going to keep this short, but we also had some other factors that we have seen in our survey that were associated with COVID-19 vaccine acceptance. For example, in both countries, if people had higher levels of anxiety about the pandemic, so if someone was more worried about catching the coronavirus or more worried about giving the coronavirus onto others, then their willingness to vaccinate for a potential COVID-19 vaccine increased, which is not that surprising given the function of anxiety. So I recommend you to have a look at this reasons for feelings, which explores why we have the bad feelings, such as anxiety or depression. What are the evolutionary underpinnings of having these feelings? And anxiety is one of the feelings that kind of prevents us from death. It's like decreases our mortality risk. So it is then not that expected that more anxious people would be more risk avoidant and then willing to accept vaccination more. And then there were several other factors as well, and I'm happy to talk about those in the question and answer section if you would like to hear more. And finally, building on others' presentations, like Alex was talking about the power of global perspectives, and I think it's very important that we do cross-cultural studies to see the levels of the behavioral responses to COVID-19 across different countries. For example, in our research, we have seen that vaccine hesitancy is much higher in Turkey than in the UK. And all these, because we are now in an interconnected world, all these responses in one country is going to be affecting our responses to the pandemic in another country as well. Yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Denise. Very topical presentation given events of the last few days, so thank you for that. Our next presenter is Carrie Ryan, who is a teaching fellow in Biosocial Medical Anthropology.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully these slides will upload. So my name is Carrie, and I am a lecturer in Biosocial Medical Anthropology, and my work is broadly concerned with questions around aging and care. And today I'm going to be suggesting how a biosocial approach helps us rethink age as a risk factor during the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, figures were showing that it was older adults who were particularly vulnerable to coronavirus mortality. This fear was exacerbated by the early onslaught of coronavirus deaths across UK care homes. While we have since learned that people across the age spectrum can be vulnerable to coronavirus mortality, today ONS figures and indeed global figures continue to show that it is older adults, more so than any other age, that have died from coronavirus. Many people have taken these figures to mean that older adults world and population-wide have a natural, inevitable biological vulnerability to coronavirus. But this view does not account for how social factors have shaped older adults' vulnerability during the pandemic. And here, a biosocial approach can help us. A biosocial approach to aging can help us see how environment, culture, and biology interact diversely to shape the experience and risk of old age. It also helps us see how there's nothing natural, inevitable, or universal about the biological experience of risk in old age. How do we know this? Well, we can look historically. In the past 100 years, life expectancy figures have practically doubled in many places across the world. Social innovations have profoundly changed the possibilities of growing older, showing us that there isn't anything natural or inevitable about human aging. We can also look globally. Being 65 in Canada is perceived as young old, where the average life expectancy is 85. But being 65 in Somalia, for example, is perceived as old, where the average life expectancy is 60. This shows us there's nothing universal about biological or chronological aging. Indeed, social inequalities profoundly shape who gets to live healthily into old age and who dies young. So what should we take from these biosocial insights? Well, biology alone does not make older adults vulnerable to coronavirus. And indeed, while old age does correlate often with weaker immune systems and more underlying conditions, it certainly does not determine those risks. In other words, as the CDC says, age is just a number. And we need to be much more specific about how social contexts shape, in both diverse and uneven ways, how people become vulnerable throughout the aging spectrum, especially during the pandemic. So let's use this biosocial insight and think about how older adults were made more vulnerable during the pandemic in two contexts: care homes and shielding. First, care homes. Despite the urgency of the pandemic, the UK government failed to respond quickly to put into place safeguarding measures to protect older adults in their cares and care homes. For months, care homes did not receive adequate PPE for their staff and certainly did not have the testing resources to ensure their staff were COVID negative. This meant that many staff had to continue to work both without adequate protection, putting themselves at risk, and without test results, putting residents at risk. The slow response to protect the care sector, its workers, and its beneficiaries are all broader symptoms of the devaluation of care work in the UK more generally. The onslaughts of deaths in care homes across the UK was not an inevitability, but was instead a product of the ways in which social and political failures during the pandemic, and for quite some time, have made the care sector increasingly vulnerable. Second, shielding. We can also see how older adults have been made more vulnerable to COVID in the case of shielding measures. Shielding has remained a popular policy idea throughout the pandemic. The proposed policy implies that segmenting and isolating the old will safeguard the vulnerable, lower coronavirus deaths, and enable economies to get started again. But shielding has had all sorts of disastrous implications for the old, and indeed people across the age spectrum. First, shielding older adults is not practically possible. In order to shield older adults, you would have also had to shield the networks of care in which they belong, including care home workers, caring children, and families they live in with intergenerational households. Shielding then is an inadequate proposal because it fails to see how deeply interconnected, and indeed, to use Alex and Dahlia's language, entangled, older adults and communities are. Testing and tracing would have been a much better policy proposal. Second, shielding the old continues the idea that it is only the old who are vulnerable to coronavirus. But indeed, people across the age spectrum are also vulnerable to coronavirus. Shielding obscures how COVID vulnerability is experienced across the age spectrum in often unequal ways. And third, and perhaps one of the most critical biosocial observations, is that shielding older adults and separating them from their communities and kin has disastrous effects on older adult well-being. Care homes across the world have reported increased deaths not from COVID, but from the isolation and loneliness brought upon by shielding. Indeed, care home workers have reported that shielding has caused a decline in their residents' cognitive, physical, and mental well-being. In particular, they suggest that malnourishment, worsening responsive behaviors, exacerbating mental conditions, and cognitive decline and delirium have become growing issues. Unfortunately, it is common in approaches to older adult care to invest in older adults' biological life at the expense of their social life. But what this pandemic is showing us is that social care, and our relations with community, kin, and friends are just as important, if not more so, in sustaining and shaping our lives. So to sum up, to understand the high mortality rates of older adults during coronavirus, we need to understand how social factors have made older adults particularly vulnerable in the pandemic. It was not biologically inevitable that so many older adults would die. Indeed, their high deaths are deeply linked to social failures during the pandemic, but also across their life course.
Thank you very much, Carrie. That was excellent and really illuminating. Thank you for that. We have our final talk in this morning's webinar, and our final talk is from Aaron Parkhurst, who is a lecturer in Biosocial Medical Anthropology.
I'm going to present something slightly different, and give a very brief thoughts on a future of biosocial research and how the body and the city are, the human body and the city are connected via COVID-19. Anthropological and geographic studies into the relationship between the human body and urban environments can highlight the role that pathology and epidemics have played in influencing urban culture and living. These scenes I've got on these animated GIFs on my screen seem like another world almost at this stage after the last 7 months, showing sort of dense crowds embedded in famous urban landscapes, pulsing with human energy and bringing life and movement into the built environment. It was about 8 years ago that something odd happened in global humanity, something that has never happened before in the history of humankind, as far as we know it. It came to be that over half of the world's population now live in cities. When we stop and think about what that means and what that is, it's almost staggering. Well over 4 billion people now live in dense, relatively crowded, urban built environments. It's only been in the last decade that the majority of the world's population now lives in these urban settings, but what compromises the concept of the urban is often, I know, fraught with debate. We don't have time to discuss that here, but London's built environment, like most major urban centers in the world, have been radically shaped by pandemics in the past. When John Snow, for example, seeing this handsome man on the screen, famously identified the handle of a water pump in London's Soho neighborhood as the source of a cholera epidemic, he set off a big chain of important events that shaped the way that water flows through the modern city. He produced, among other things, this famous map that I've got here on the right. In 1854, it shows the deaths caused by a cholera outbreak in Soho, here in London, and the locations of water pumps in the area. On this slide, it's overlaid by Dr. Robin Wilson with death concentrations in red and public water pumps in blue. By doing this, he found that there was a significant clustering of deaths around a certain pump, and when he removed the handle of the pump, quite famously, he stopped the outbreak. This is, of course, a grand oversimplification, but it's more or less what had happened. It demonstrates something so simple and seemingly so obvious, but largely ignored. London had been no stranger to massive cholera epidemics before Snow's work, but he demonstrated that the structures of our city directly impact upon the human body in cascading and complex ways that we often take for granted. His findings led to massive architectural reform that helped create the image of the modern Thames River, it influencing the culture of the city, and indeed, it set the foundation for the modern study of epidemiology. The biosocial framework here is simple but profound, I argue. Cities and the human body are procreative of one another. Human health and well-being can then be seen as interwoven biological and social constructs that exist at the nexus of such a relationship. Urban spaces, how we feel as corporeal human bodies living in and moving through them, can often seem strange and manufactured, and in many ways they very much are strange and manufactured. Experimental social science, psychology, and neuroscience has recently begun charting cognitive and biosocial shifts that occur simply through moving through urban landscapes, hearing and perhaps witnessing unnatural sounds of the city, and gazing upon the lines and geometry of tall towers and office blocks that are so otherworldly to, say, the forests and the grassy plains. We're simply used to cities and how we feel about cities, and so we do naturalize them to a certain extent. Richard Sennett, famous London geographer, erases this naturalization in his work. And he sees the city more of as a dynamic organism that has the capability of acting on our bodies, even as we act upon it, and of creating our understanding of ourselves in relation to it. And he says that the city makes and is made just as we make and are made. The generative power at play in the relationship between a city and its residents flows both ways. COVID-19, like pandemics in the past, offers both a warning on the past failures of this relationship, but also an opportunity to think through future structures of the city. For example, the current pandemic affords the chance to question the promise of urban density as a construct that improves well-being in terms of access to and efficiency of urban life, but it challenges well-being by creating potential conditions for the spread of illness. As Richard Sennett explains, one of the most pressing questions that urban planners will face after this pandemic is the apparent tension between densification, the push towards cities becoming more concentrated, which is seen as essential to improving environmental sustainability, and disaggregation, the separating out of populations, which is one of the key tools currently being used to hold back infection transmission. Such questions are not new, but COVID in many ways forces debate on how to manage such shifts and what the effects of an emptying city might have on the health of the individual in ways one might not anticipate. For example, independent of COVID, Detroit in the United States has been heralded as the decline of the American empire, a model sick city. Within my lifetime, the population of Detroit has decreased by over half, leaving parts of the city a shell of their former industrialized selves. The effect that such urban decline has had on the health of its remaining residents these past 3 decades is very well documented. For many people, COVID has provided the impetus to really question how connected one really needs to be with the city, yet as offices across the city empty and cancel rent for the unforeseeable future, and shops on high streets begin to board up, walking life leaves city planners highly anxious. And finally, at the same time, COVID-19 challenges employment and labor structures and gives pause to think about the nature of the urban commute. The commute, this metaphorical bloodstream of the city, brings life and labor into the center, promoting economy and even creativity. However, the commute reflects urban sprawl, informing the conditions that lead to chronic illnesses. So you can see the image of Waterloo Station here in London on an average London non-COVIDian commute. Over 100 million interchanges occur here yearly. Such a commute adds, on average, over 2 hours to a London commuter's day. This has a radical effect on the culture of a city and the culture of its public health. The time to exercise, to maintain healthy diets, to spend time with your family, and to commit to sustainable health-seeking behaviors. Social theorists have long made metaphors between the urban commute as the veins and arteries of the city, making concrete, in a way, the link between the human body and the city in which it moves. A biosocial anthropology complexifies this metaphor, concretizing these structures as getting under the skin. So I suggest, briefly, if a biosocial anthropology of the body can ask how cities and bodies shape each other, the challenges of a pandemic give us the ethnographic moment to explore this aspect of health in ways we might not witness otherwise. Great.
Thank you very much. And that completes our set of presentations this morning. We hope it's been really enjoyable. You've had quite a broad spectrum view, really, on what the biosocial approach is and how it's relevant to COVID-19. We do have some minutes, not as many as we hope, but some minutes left for questions. And really all our speakers, who maybe could just turn their cameras on as well, are available to answer any questions people have, any specific questions or more general as well about the presentations or about the programme in itself. Please indicate with a hand, or if you'd like to post a question in the chat, that's also possible. But I know there are still many people here who maybe not familiar with biosocial medical anthropology, want to know more about that, or any of the very fascinating talks that we've heard this morning as well. Yeah, Ellie Danzio, you have a question. Please, I think your hand's up, yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Thank you very much for these great presentations. I was wondering, in terms of ethnographic sites and methods, what's in this midst of COVID-19, you have lots of things you can investigate. Do you have some ideas of the most privileged sites you'd like to explore ethnographically to answer all these biosocial questions?
That's a very good question, because of course we're all somewhat restricted at the moment in exploring ethnography, biosocial medical anthropology, as much as as much as medical and social or any other form of anthropology, because of the ethnographic method. But it's very impressive, and perhaps Denise would like to talk about this a little bit. That that some projects are possible, and they're possible through creative means, digital means, and others as well. But I think it's a huge challenge for all of us. But opportunities maybe as well. But Denise, I don't know if you want to talk about how your project was made possible in this context.
You mean the survey or the more hunter-gatherers?
I meant the recent project in Turkey, really.
Yeah. Well, because I have, just to give you an information, I have two sets of projects now. One, I have been studying modern day hunter-gatherers, so like doing biological and ethnographic research as well. But since the COVID, I haven't been able to go to Congo. And I was also interested in doing more cross-cultural studies, like looking at behavior in both modern day hunter-gatherers and across different Western populations. And I'm from Turkey. And of course, being from Turkey, it helped me with, getting access to Turkish research permits and finding a collaborator in Turkey. And the reason why I have decided to do a comparative study between Turkey and the UK was because I spent the lockdown in Turkey, the first lockdown, and I realized that there have been really a huge rise in conspiracy theories. And I was already quite interested in the rise of conspiracy theories in Turkey, not only COVID related, but there's a lot of, health related conspiracies going on as well. Like my dad was telling me that he was reading this book that were talking about vaccines and harmfulness. And he was asking me questions, and I was, I started getting worried that there is a lot of misinformation as well. So that's kind of fueled my interest in doing a comparative study, because I wanted to see whether there are cultural differences in behavioral responses and why some countries, they may be more, people may be more inclined to believe conspiracies and develop hesitancy in vaccines as well. So I applied to some grants to do further research where I can also interview people, not only a survey, but online interviews. So I think that's one way to do ethnographic research now in time of COVID, that you can do online interviews rather than face-to-face. Yeah.
Thanks, Denise. Alex, did you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry, if that's all right. It was really to build on what Denise was saying, but I didn't quite get whether the question was where would you do ethnographic research, or how could ethnographic research be used, because they are slightly different kind of, I think, in some ways questions. But I'd add to Denise, or if conceptually, this idea of how do people take knowledge, or what knowledges are preferenced or privileged over others. And I would suggest that an ethnography of power would be helpful. So looking at how, for example, governments, actors, local and national groups or individuals, communities use information that's coming out. I mean, one really classic example for any of you who are involved in academia is that preprints are going through the roof now. So obviously there are lots and lots of publications out there which have never been through a peer review process, have never been adopted by the academy, whatever you want to say. But it's in order to get that information out quickly. So where is that information? How is it being used? What do people think about it? And so actually, from a kind of social side, situating oneself within these conversations around people, how people are being forced to cross outside of their comfort zones and disciplines to engage with things, I think would be very powerful. And I know there are some going on. Even with Diana, we're both involved in a project looking at localized contact tracing. So the use, rather than use of a national system, but localized systems. And I mean, that really illustrated how contextual information and local knowledge was useful to the state system. But I think it'd also be interesting to look at how wider global knowledge, whatever you want to call it, is translated into local context, which is where ethnography could really help. It's just a thought.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Ellie. Yeah, I mean, just to pick up a little bit, I think the issue of collaboration is really unfolding in fascinating ways in the field of anthropology. I mean, I think that there are many projects on the go in the department actually which have involved collaborative kind of projects that have evolved in different sorts of ways. So I think that's a terrain that biosocial medical anthropology, with its very cross-disciplinary agenda, is very well positioned to develop collaborations. And so I think that's potentially a terrain that's going to expand in the field as we go forward as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments or questions people had? We have only a few minutes. I'm sorry, it's gone rather quickly, but I did have, maybe I can pose a question, because I think it's kind of very topical. Maybe this is really, I don't know if Dalia is still here, but or Alex, but the recent the unfolding of the story of the mink farms in Denmark, and how this really kind of may change the parameters of how we think about the situation with the coronavirus, and going forward as well, how we kind of draw on these kind of multi-species entanglement approaches to sort of understand whether that's something that is relevant at the moment, the unfolding story of the mink farms in Denmark.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Sorry, Alex, did you want to start? Or?
I was literally going to throw it over to you, if that's all right, because I just told you so.
No, only really to say that I guess it highlights these conversations about the value of life, or whose lives also become seen as being more important, and how these kinds of diseases are tackled, because we often see this in kind of zoonotic infections, or infections that involve also kind of animals or insect vectors, that actually they become the immediate target of intervention. So these minks are being killed, but actually these are also kind of really intertwined with people's livelihoods, and they tend to be, people who can be also marginalized in society as well. So I guess it just draws a light again on how entangled all of this is, but actually in terms of the response and the interventions that are put forward, it often targets only one kind of species or one element of that, without seeing the kind of wider view that's going on here. So I mean, I'm not to say that I think that these animals shouldn't have been. I don't really know what the solution is, but I think it just points out this kind of idea of the value of life and livelihoods, and how actually they're so kind of intertwined.
Thanks for that. Yeah.
I mean, just if you're right, just to put one, I think I completely agree with Dalia, and I think there's also I would probably be a bit political now. There's an unhelpful conversation about health versus wealth that's starting to emerge, and I'm not sure that's a dichotomy that's always as helpful as people think it might be. And the other thing is to say that if depending on how you're looking at the agents involved, cats have had coronaviruses for thousands of years. Humans have. The coronavirus in itself is not a novel item, and it has multiple species in which it lives. But what we're looking at is how are those shifts happening, and then how are those shifts being framed in terms of what we do about it. I mean, culling is an interventionist approach, which has been used in a whole range of veterinary public health and human public health situations, but it has very different outcomes. So I know, for example, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, the outcome is very, very different to if you look at the UK. With the badger culling context, that's another political hot potato. A lot of UK badgers, if you cull an area, it causes greater dispersal. So actually, there's a narrative which preferences the removal of the agent by the culling of those animals, but it doesn't necessarily have the effect or the impact that we're actually talking about. But the narratives are very strong around it. But I mean, feel free to disagree, anyone.
Thank you for those responses, Dalia and Alex. Yeah, no, I think it's a really important terrain in which biosocial medical anthropology can also begin to tease out some of the questions that are relevant. We are over time, and I can't see that there are more questions on the chat. So I think at the moment we will bring this to a close, but this recording will be available to view afterwards, and there'll be information that's put up on the screen by Anna as well about how you can find out more about biosocial medical anthropology and the programme. And there will be further webinars this term as well, and we'll keep people posted about those as they appear and form. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope it's been of interest and you've enjoyed the webinar, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.